Hello again, dear colleagues. So thank you all for joining this conference. I see our speakers as well as the guests who registered for this conference. So now we move to the program, and we move to the first keynote lecture. Professor Marcin Wodziński. Dear Marcin, are you here?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you very well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I'm proud to introduce our first speaker, keynote speaker, Marcin Wodziński, who is a professor of Jewish studies at the University of Wroclaw, Poland, where he heads the university's Department of Jewish Studies. Professor Wodziński is a very productive author of the following books: Jews in Silesia, Haskalah and Hasidism in the Kingdom of Poland, A History of Conflict, Hasidism and Politics, the Kingdom of Poland, Historical Atlas of Hasidism, Hasidism Key Questions, and co-author of the book Hasidism and New History. Am I right, Marcin?
That's right. One of the co-authors is with us here, Benjamin
Brown. Benjamin Brown, yes, right. So the lecture by Professor Marcin Wodziński, the title of the lecture, you see, Hasidism, Maskilim, and Others, How to Write History of Jewish Eastern Europe. So welcome.
Thank you very much. If it's possible for me to share the screen, it would be helpful because I have some images to show. Not immediately at the beginning, but it will come soon. Thank you. Thank you again for inviting me, for introducing me. I'm very happy to be with you in this very unfortunate format. I very much miss your presence and seeing you reacting to what I want to say. I very much hope you disagree, and I would like to see it in your faces, and I would like to hear you screaming at me for what I say in a minute. Unfortunately, it is not so with electronic media, but that's the best we can have in this situation. And it's especially pity we cannot meet in person, because I have such warm feelings for the urban center in Lviv, great place and great people working there. It would be so great to be there together with others, together with my co-key lecturer, Professor Feiner. Again, thank you for inviting me. This is a great honor for me. And let me get straight to my main points, which I hope to finish in less than 40 minutes, maybe something like 35 to 40 minutes. And then I very much hope for a discussion. In some way, I expect all this conference will be a discussion and a response to what I want to throw on you in this opening lecture, but let me start. Start with a very general observation about the topic and our presence here. From the presence of so many distinguished scholars at this conference, I just see Daniel Reiser. Hello, Daniel. I assume that what gathers us here at this conference is a kind of general assumption, conviction about the importance, indeed maybe centrality of the topic of Hasidism, Haskalah, maybe also about the centrality of the conflict between Hasidism and Haskalah. I'm not sure what the organizer of this conference meant by "and." Is it more comma, or this is something that is going to juxtapose those two, as it's very often? But today, we can hear this kind of debate about religious and secular, about conservative and progressive, about all those dichotomies, and especially dichotomies that polarize our work today, more and more present in our everyday life, and very often with gestures to the past, looking for kind of model or actually kind of continuity between supposed, I stress the word, supposed conflict between Haskalah and Hasidism in the 18th and 19th century, right? This assumption about centrality of those topics and this conflict has both academic and popular root, mostly in traditional narratives about eternal enmity between Hasidism and Haskalah, and kind of a Manichaean vision of Jewish life divided between those two opponents, right? Between the Hasidim, the Hasidim, and their opponents, mostly the Maskilim. And I'm not implying that people at this conference share this conviction. I'm sure that all we are aware of the constructed nature of these narratives. Obviously, there is much research on how this has been constructed, and in a significant part by participants of this conference, right? So that's quite clear to me. But even for those who are crystal clear about it, about the constructed nature of centrality of those topics and this conflict, there is still, I believe, a lure of importance in those topics and this conflict. And as I assume this conference demonstrates, or it might be so that this is so central and important to me that I project my own images and convictions on you, but it was exactly my experience when I moved from Jewish sepulchral culture and Hebrew epigraphy into the field of Hasidic and Haskalah as a field of study. I was amazed. I was so much thrilled by the vitality of this subfield, about so many people, so much involved, so much of so much lively academic life, and on. And actually, my teacher and mentor, Professor Moshe Rossman, warned me that this is especially crowded field, and actually maybe not so easy for an outsider as I was then. And obviously, Professor Rossman was right about it, but maybe that is what it was so attractive about this field. But after 30 years in the field, I would like to look on this issue from somehow different perspective, and I would like, together with you today, to pose questions to some of the convictions and beliefs that we might share, and maybe it's good to have second thoughts on those. Namely, is it really so that the topic of Hasidism and to some extent Haskalah are central to contemporary Jewish historiography, as was my experience, which I've just described? And if so, if it's true, why is it so? Or is it rightly so? Meaning, if Hasidism and Haskalah are indeed central historical phenomena to shape Jewish life in Eastern Europe, and to what extent it is so, and what should we do? What does it mean for us, right? So let me try to respond to some of those questions that I ask in sequence, starting with the most general one. And here I will need slides. But this is, as I was citing Professor Rossman talking about such a crowded area of Hasidic studies and saying that it might be actually not always amicable to all the members. There are actually hard clashes in the field. We know about the well-known and well-described conflict between intellectual history and social history, which is, I believe, dying out today. But there are also other clashes in this field, around perspectives from historical side, anthropological, and others. But still, this is very lively field that obviously has big attraction to many people, especially for people from small centers like Wrocław, like I'm from, that needed academic environment to develop in lively interactions. Professor Rossman, when writing about Hasidism in his article for Zion, I think almost 20 years ago, he counted publications on Hasidism and concluded that actually Hasidism, if we count by numbers of articles in Zion and some other prominent Israeli places, Hasidism is still the most popular research topic for Israeli historiography. And I did it for other venues of publication. For example, if you go into Polin, Journal on Polish Jewish History, actually Polish meaning is all East European Jewish history, there were 3 volumes devoted to Jewish religious life and Jewish religious experience. In all 3 volumes, there were together 44 articles, 22 of them, exactly 50%, dealt either exclusively or predominantly with Hasidism. So we can obviously say that if we come in this area of Jewish religious life, Hasidism was big. And if you go into articles, books on this topic in any language, actually, you have hundreds and hundreds of publications every year. It's impossible to follow every publication on these topics today. Several weeks ago, actually, I did a basic search in the National Library of Israel for the keyword Hasidism and Hasidut, and the outcome together in English and Hebrew was 29,804 books, in addition to nearly 19,000 books for the entry Hasidism and Hasidim. To compare it, similar search for Zionism gives less than 17,000, and for Haskalah as little as 4,000. And this obviously demonstrates the importance, which tempts us to believe that Hasidism is indeed the central topic for Jewish historiography. Yet, in order to see things in, understand them really, we need to look at them in proportions. We need to see them in comparative perspective. And here I would like to present to you some of comparative perspective I have, namely, what are the numbers of presentations at World Congress of Jewish Studies and in 3 leading Judaica journals of global reach: AJS Review, Jewish Quarterly Review, and Jewish Social Studies. And here are numbers divided not by topics, but for area they cover. As you can see, for the Congress, the biggest interest is obviously in Israel, which is both ancient and contemporary, followed by the Middle East, Germany and France, then Eastern Europe only. So as you see from this chart, both for major publications and Congress, which I believe is in many ways indicative. It might overrepresent Israelis, but in general, this is very indicative of what's happening in Jewish studies globally. In this chart, you see that any topic related to Eastern Europe is secondary. It's not marginal. It's not like North Africa or Latin America, which are almost invisible in research, but still this is secondary, far beyond Israel, Middle East, Germany, and France. But this is about general about Eastern Europe. If we go into individual topics or disciplinary areas of studies, I did it for different countries of East Central Europe, as we like to call it in Poland, not Eastern Europe. And here you have my chart for 5 categories, 5 biggest categories that appear in Rambi search, right? So as you see here, for Poland, 52% of articles registered for Rambi with Poland as geographical category, as geographical tag, 52% of all the articles deal with the Holocaust. Another 10% with anti-Semitism. Then what we have, literature, religion, and arts collectively, including Hasidism, Haskalah, Yiddish literature, and all other topics. This is below 15%, right? Each of them is 4, 5, 6%. And it's not much better for other countries. For Ukraine, it's 27% that deals with the Holocaust and 14% with anti-Semitism. Then we have 7% for literature, 6% for religion, and 8% for arts, including synagogal art, traditional and modern art, all together, right? But what we should be interested in is this category religion, because it covers all of publications on Hasidism. And if you look on this chart, with all the bias of RAM research, and there is no point to go into this because this is secondary to what I'm trying to say. It shows that when we compare our subfield that we might believe is so much blooming, if we compare it to other subfields in Jewish studies, it is certainly not a central topic anymore. And again, if we look into Pauline, was what I was saying, in 3 volumes on religious life, Hasidism is half of those volumes. And you might say that for 34 volumes of Pauline, 3 volumes on religion is a lot. But still, if you look into the remaining volumes, the presence of Hasidism, Haskalah, and religious life is marginal compared to topics as presented here. If you go for category of Ukraine, if you enter Rambi, and if you type Ukraine, what you get, this is it's a bit more than 5,400 entries that come together. And of those, as you see, 27 for Holocaust, 14 for anti-Semitism. You see Hasidism and Haskalah on the level of 2 and 1% of the corpus. And that's reality about how central those topics really are for the big field. To conclude, Hasidism, let alone the Haskalah, are far from being central topics in the field of East European Jewish studies, and even less so for the general area of Jewish studies, if we look on this from the global perspective. And I think this is not the place to discuss the ethnocentric and actually colonial origins and development of those stereotypes in the modernization narratives and in general perspectives, but it is important to remember about place of our topics when studying them in the general field and how it looks. But this is one of the stereotypes, or maybe one of the misleading impressions I had, and I believe some of us have, when looking on the field of especially Hasidism and in some way Haskalah. And this is in some way connected to those narratives that I was referring to in the very beginning, which I believe might be more important stereotype in what we perceive as centrality of the two topics and the discussion of Hasidism and Haskalah. Namely, we look on Hasidism as, well, again, I'm talking about popular stereotypes that influence our attraction to some areas. Historically, Hasidism presented itself as the epitome or embodiment of Jewish tradition. It claimed it conquered all of Eastern Europe and left little behind. Today, we are closer to understanding the Hasidic conquest as the rhetorical tool in strive for social position rather than social and demographical reality. But still, even if we understand that many, and in some areas, the great majority of East European Jews were not the Hasidim, and certainly not the Maskilim, the question is that we know very little about those others. We know very little about their religious life, experiences, beliefs, convictions, especially if they are not part of the rabbinical elite. And to this, I have several suggestions, maybe 2 major suggestions that I believe our field should reconsider in order to better place our studies in context, but also to expand into the areas that I believe are heavily under-researched when thinking about Jewish studies in general and study of Jewish religion and Jewish religion in Eastern Europe in particular. My first suggestion is to de-essentialize Hasidism. By this, I mean shifting the focus of the study of Hasidism from essentialized Hasidut, usually perceived as ideas or central institutions. And here I don't mean my criticism of Machshavet Israel, of the intellectual history of Hasidism. I am speaking about both intellectual history of Hasidism and institutional history of Hasidism, both social and intellectual perspectives on this. What I'm speaking about here is a kind of a priori definition of what Hasidism is and what it is not, that allows us to easily to get rid of phenomena that would complicate our discussion of what's happening in the field. And I would say that this kind of de-essentializing attempt is happening already in the study of Hasidism, with many significant, I would say, with several groundbreaking publications by some of my friends and colleagues. And this is something that can be put under the most general rubric of Hasidism as a religious culture, more than Hasidism as institution or set of beliefs. And this brings us closer to categories that are so important for contemporary study of religions, especially for contemporary comparative study of religions, such as everyday religion or vernacular religion, that allows us to go beyond those traditional perspectives. What do we gain with such a perspective? I would say that we gain what we were losing so far, and most significantly, we gain women. I'm sure there's no need to convince anybody about importance of this research topic and this perspective. Let me remind where we are with this conflict. I brought this image of the book on the Maiden of Lviv on purpose because it emphasizes what Ada Albert taught about wrong perspectives on studying women in Hasidism, namely focusing on exceptional cases to illustrate what is relation between women and Hasidism. But even if we reject those most extreme cases, we have quite a vibrant discussion, and I was part of this discussion also with my article about women in Hasidism in non-sectarian perspective, about whether women are or are not Hasidot. Well, female Hasidim may be better than Hasidot, okay? And I was claiming they were not. Institutionally, they were excluded, and I believe this is a correct conclusion. But I have also a feeling that I did not take full, I did not follow all the implications of what it means, and there's too little of an attempt of understanding if they are of the implication of the fact that if they are not members of Hasidism as institution, what does it say? Does it exclude them from research on Hasidism entirely? Or maybe, as I'm trying to suggest, it creates new space for redefining relation between participation in the broader cultural phenomenon of Hasidism by women and by others, and Hasidism itself. Namely, looking into entirely different categories that might allow us to understand what are relations between those who are not certified members of the Hasidic Hevra, who are not sitting all the afternoon at Bet Midrash of the, Shtibel of the Hasidim, or maybe they don't go for the pilgrimage to the Rebbe, but they do go with the kvittel to the Rebbe when he comes to their town. They do tell Hasidic stories. They do believe in religious powers of the tzaddikim, and they keep many of the Hasidim in high esteem. So the question is, what would we gain if we de-essentialize definition, if we go beyond looking into Hasidism within those essentialized boundaries that much of the research is focusing on? I believe this would allow us to see much more And I say woman is a good example, but it can go into many smaller and bigger topics as well. I'm not sure if Yoni Meyer joined us already, but when thinking about this, one of the categories that came to my mind came from Josef Perl. You might remember that he was writing about some of the people in some areas. He was claiming in Galicia that the Hasidim constitute absolute majority of the local male population. Those people who are not Hasidim, they are forced to be Hasidim. He called them Anusim. Maranos, well, those who are enforced into joining Hasidic ranks. And this is a very dramatic formulation from his side, which might be true for some. I would assume that for the majority of those who did not feel the big pressure to join Hasidism, but still they did join, there was a level of conformism, or there was a level of laziness, simply. If there's no other shul in the area, they could join the closest one. If it's Hasidic, they did not care not to do it, right? But then the question is, what is their religiosity? How does it inform their relation with ideas, institutions, practices of what we defined as Hasidism, what we know by the corpus of this essentialized perspective on Hasidism as central for being Hasid and being part of this community. So that's my first suggestion. Second suggestion for how we can go outside of what I believe is still too constrained by the notional stereotype of centrality of Hasidism, is to look beyond the polarized divide of Hasidism and Haskalah, to look into the questions: what were religious beliefs and practices of not the Hasidim and not the Maskilim, but so-called Prosteiden, rank and file Jews. And here, the most typical narrative about those Prosteiden is that we know very little about their religiosity because there are no sources for this. I believe this is a major mistake, which has kind of circular nature. We don't study those aspects for some reasons, so we don't know the sources. And if we don't know the sources, we don't know how to get to those topics. So let me suggest two very simple attempts how to make it. How to get into religious life of non-Hasidic, non-Maskilic, simple Jews of Eastern Europe and what was their religious world, and maybe referring to point A, what I was saying before, into the essentialized category of Hasidism. Where are the soft connections, the gray areas between being Hasidic and being non-Hasidic or a-Hasidic, sometimes anti-Hasidic in some situations? And first of such sources is folklore of the Jewish Eastern Europe. As you know, ethnographic studies of Jewish religious life in Eastern Europe were once, I would say 100 and 120 years ago, they were one of the most important areas, the second after historiography, right? And for many good reasons, it is not so anymore. There are some projects that still keep importance of sociology, like Israel Folktale Archives, that still collect some sources, that still produce impressive, actually, outcomes. But for many good reasons, there is very little research on Jewish folklore in Eastern Europe, for the simple reason that for almost 8 years, there's no Jewish folklore of Eastern Europe, especially if we look on folklore in this most traditional way of speaking about traditional folk cultures, right? Because there are no Jewish communities in big part of Eastern Europe. Where they became mostly urbanized, modernized, and not part of this traditional life that folkloristics and ethnography would pay attention to describe and to analyze. And what is happening with those areas of ethnography and folklore is actually very interesting and indicative. Let me focus for a moment on Poland, because I think this is kind of paradigmatic case. What is happening in Poland for the last 20 years is shift from studying Jewish folklore to studying Polish folklore on the Jews. which is a good topic to study, obviously, but the concern, the objective of this study is much more to learn about Polish culture than to know Jewish past and Jewish culture, right? This is not Jewish folklore. This is not Jewish ethnography. What's happening with those studies of the image of the Jew in Polish traditional culture, with this image of Polish Polish folk in relation to blood libel and all other anti-Jewish beliefs and practices, right? Still, with all those limitations, we have huge corpus of ethnographic materials created from the late 19th century that today is hardly touched, and we know extremely little about it, even though it brings amazing rich materials for us to understand the Jewish religious life in Eastern Europe, including Hasidism. And what I did is I collected just 2 quotes from Regina Lilienthalova from a new edition of her complete ethnographic writings. That is under edition, is not available yet. As you might know, Lilienthalova died almost 100 years ago in very early age, and was never prepared for publication in entirety. And the person who, Piotr Grącikowski, who was working for almost 10 years on the critical edition of her writings, died a bit more than half a year ago of COVID, and he left it. But still, much of these writings are ready for publication, which we hope will happen in some near future. What I did is I just sampled 2 short quotes of what Lilienthalova reports as folk beliefs about them. It's not that she says they do it, right? It is says that people report. And if you look on this, I selected on purpose those who refer to marital life and women, because this brings us back to the point that I was discussing just 5 minutes ago, that allows to see how we can accumulate information on those areas on which we collectively believe that we have so little information, that it's so preciously few pieces of information about a sexual life, relation to women, place of women within this world, that we need to care for all of those. As I say, 5 minutes random search in the collection of Regina Lilienthalova allows us to see this and many more of those kind of insights into what Hasidim do during a marriage ceremony of one of them, right? Or what the simple folk beliefs about sexual desire of women, of Hasidim, and their sexual behaviors. Especially fascinating to me the last quote: "The more pious man, the more desire he has for a woman. The Hasidim are especially hungry for their wives," it says. So it does not apply any extra marriage relations, but it simply says that they are especially sexually active. Extremely interesting. And again, it's not about Hasidic practices that it teaches us. It teaches us about what non-Hasidic, or maybe also Hasidic, but what simple people of Jewish Eastern Europe 120 years ago believed. This is one of the corpora that I believe are still in our disposal that we are not doing, but there are several others, at least several others. One of them is sepulchral culture and Hebrew epigraphy. And again, I'm talking about this issue again and again in many venues. But if there's anybody here who didn't hear me about importance of Hebrew epigraphy, I need to reiterate it. If we look on Hebrew inscriptions in Eastern Europe, the oldest one 1203, then reaching up to well into the late 20th century, but actually ending this traditional form of Hebrew epigraphy in the mid-20th century. In Poland alone, it's several million epitaphs. We don't know how many. I say several millions because we know there's, roughly speaking, 250,000 in Warsaw alone. Maybe it's 180,000 in Łódź, and on, and many other big and small cemeteries, which is the biggest corpus of sources we can imagine. And until very recently, we had no idea what to do about it, how to document it, and how to get into studying it. Today, with development of digital humanities, we are far closer to tools that would allow us to document it in big quantities and to make sense of this. A doctoral student in Wroclaw is writing his PhD dissertation on 25,000 Hebrew inscriptions in Eastern and Central Europe. He's comparing two data sets from one of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and one from the Roman Empire of the German nation. Each of them is almost 13,000, and he's comparing the patterns of development of epigraphy. And this is possible because he's working on a corpus of sources. So that's another piece of the sources that that might be important for understanding Jewish religious life in Eastern Europe in general, but also connection between Hasidism and non-Hasidim, the simple versions, but also those more developed. And here I'm referring back to my first book on Hasidism that I published in 1997, which was on the graves of tzaddikim in Poland, where I studied Hebrew epigraphy on those graves of tzaddikim. I was speaking about Hasidism very much, but I would like to suggest that we might take similar steps in relation to Haskalah being essential form for Jewish modernity, and to be sure, there's much literature questioning the modernity of the Haskalah and many of the stereotypes around this topic. And Israel Bartal, a teacher of several of us here, wrote several important articles about it. Shmuel Feiner wrote about several of those founding stereotypes, starting with the stereotype of Moses Mendelssohn as the founding father, and down to the concept of modernity of the Haskalah. But with all those information, with all this knowledge, where are we in regard to the more general modernization theories, actually the modernization processes of Jewish Eastern Europe? What do we know about relations between the Haskalah and other forms of secularization and modernization of East European Jews? Or maybe I should ask, do we really need Haskalah for our modernization narratives of East European Jews? In which regard? To what extent? And this is not about the definition of the Haskalah, which I believe we have excellent definition by now. What I'm rather asking is why the Haskalah is still so central in our research projects and historical narratives that we create. And I'm asking this question to myself too, as with my old and new projects on the Jewish Enlightenment. I'm certainly part of this trend. Well, I have some responses to this, but I'm not sure this is all, and I would like to throw those questions into this audience, maybe to conceptualize, to understand it better. Part of the problem, obviously, is the conception, the lack of the terminological and especially conceptual clarity between various historical agents of what we put under the most general rubric of civilization or progress, that we have the Haskalah, progressive, liberal, reform, Judaism, that we have acculturation, assimilation, and all those issues that go together under this category. And until today, we don't have very clear conceptual dividing lines that would allow a student, and I'm talking now about, I don't know, my MA or my PhD students who come to the field and they want to know who is who and what is what, and they look for simple answers and they don't find them. Well, for historical research, it's always good when answers are not easy, because historical reality is not so. But if we are unable to develop it for their use, it might create problem. But the bigger part, the biggest challenge, I believe, is not about the conceptual clarity, but more about how strongly we are indebted to traditional neutral kind of neutral narratives that intuitively explain agents of modernization, and especially, I mean here, the debate about who is the Maskil and who is assimilationist. I refer to my very old research on this, and the debate that I believe never ended properly with useful conclusions. If we go, first of all, the category of assimilation as a central category appears only with the Zionist debate about what is assimilation and why the Zionists do not like it, right? throughout most of the 19th century, throughout most of the period of the flourishing of the Haskalah, there's no category of assimilation in use. If assimilation appears, it is always with an adjective saying linguistic assimilation, or assimilation in manners, or assimilation in dress, or religious assimilation, meaning just conversion, right? So it can be either radical or very conservative, but assimilation as such is on the program. It came only in the 1880s as the label that was to demonize, to marginalize so-called assimilationists in debate against them, and it leaves the bad taste of the category of assimilation. That's interesting because if we, when you speak about assimilation in English, this is purely neutral term. If you speak about this category in Hebrew, it's always negative term. If you speak in Polish about assimilation, that is interesting. We have two words. One word is assimilation, which is neutral to positive, and it always describes assimilation into Polishness. If somebody is becoming non-Pol, if a Pole is becoming German, it is not asymilacja, it's wynarodowienie. It's outrootedness, right? So there's obviously a value category in describing this. And this is projected on category of Haskalah for long. So if Jakub Szacki or Rafael Male were writing about Maskilim of early 19th century, they were dividing people into Maskilim and assimilationists on the basis of not their ideologies or their activities in the realm of Jewish community, but rather on their moral character. Tugendhat could not be a maskil, even though he was fully maskil in his ideas and he wrote in both Polish and Hebrew, for the simple reason that he was a police denouncer. He was informer for the police, and he was very, actually, he was not very likable person. So if such a person, he cannot be maskil, right? He cannot be our hero, simply put. We discuss all the arguments pro and against in this debate, but I don't see conclusions in research coming out of this field. What are the ways out of this? If I have still, 5 minutes?
Yes, Marcin, 5 minutes, please.
Okay,
great. 5 or even even 10 minutes.
Okay, so I'll try to do it in 5 minutes. I very much hope for discussion. I have 3 suggestions where we can go. And actually all the 3 suggestions were already voiced before, but I would like to say again something about their importance for where we go with the research on Hasidism and Haskalah, and those areas that I believe are adjacent and not covered properly enough so far, as I was just suggesting. One is the digital turn, which I've already mentioned and several times. And I believe there's no need to convince you about the importance of what is happening in digital humanities today. I believe this is a tool. It's not a methodology, but it's a research tool that has huge potential for changing what we do in regard of Hasidism and Haskalah. And this is already happening. What I'm saying is that if I'm right that in 20 years' time from now, it will be impossible to do any historical research without using some sort of digital tools. And I don't mean typing it on computer, right? I don't mean searching for an article in online database. I mean using some of the software tools to manipulate our research data. If I'm right that it will be impossible to do research without it, which doesn't mean that all the research will be digital humanities, but it means that elements of digital humanities will be indispensable part of historical equipment, I believe we need to be faster in introducing those new tools into our field, especially that it's so easy to become outdated. And what we face in historiography, in the humanities generally, worldwide now, is the race for occupying central positions within the field of digital humanities. And actually, Israeli digital humanities in general are quite strong in several areas of this research, I believe we need to think about our subfields of Hasidism, Haskalah, and Jewish religious life in Eastern Europe, more so as important aspect of those research projects. Let me mention 2 or 3 projects that are close to my heart. One of them by Gadi Sagiv, headed by Gadi Sagiv. This is a team of mostly Israeli scholars who are now putting into an online database, fully operable online database, all the Hasidic stories. The first stage of the project is to do it for all the stories up to 1914, which is roughly speaking third of the corpus. But this idea is, you can immediately understand great importance of the final outcome. If we have all, roughly speaking, 15,000 of the Hasidic stories that exist today in one corpus, we can do research either on Hasidism or on Haskalah or any other topic, starting from local histories, genealogy, biographies of individual people, economical history, social history, all other areas we can do with this amazing corpus of sources, which cover so densely so many hundreds and hundreds of places in Eastern Europe in a long period from mid-18, actually early 18 up to mid-20th century. And this is happening now. The outcomes, the major problem with DH projects is that the first traceable, the first measurable outcomes of project come only towards the very end of the project itself. So it's unlike in other areas, more traditional, when you might have first article, first test case very early on. Here you need to start with very intensive building of the database and entering the data, correcting the data, and then testing how it goes before the first outcomes come. And this is usually very late in stage. So as I say, this project has just started, and it will take several years before you will be able to have first outcomes of this. But I think this is a very good indication of where research can go. And here you will be able to go through every text and to find locations, then compare to those locations, individuals and other issues, right? Another database that is not under construction now is the database of all the Prenumeranten of Hebrew books. And this is the source that is traditionally used in Jewish historiography, starting from the 19th century already, a lot well recognized. But what is happening today is construction of a corpus that will be fully operable online, that will allow for mapping, networking, digesting of any information, of any profile of information on individual, on locality, on category, and looking for similarities between different books, looking for trade routes for those books, and looking for tens and hundreds of other data, either individual data for your research, but also building research questions that has been or will be answered with those data. And this is much larger than what Kagan and Katsaf covered in their publications. And even more so, this will be online, this will be digital. So with one click, it will allow to go into researching, for example, who subscribed to Maskilim books in Eastern Europe, 1800 to 1850, with actually very short search, you will have the list. But it is not only this. You will be able to see what other books those people who subscribe to the book of your author or your authors subscribe to. So what was their libraries? So what was the wider environment of books read by this circle of readers of A, among other authors, right? So that's another one. One such great project is the Library of the Haskalah, which is great, and it's entering into this area. This is collection of information on 525 most important books for the German actually for the German Haskalah, because it doesn't enter into East European Haskalah. So I understand this is the first stage that allows us to go further. But with Maskilim library, we can do so much more. I wanted to talk about Abraham Stern and his library that I'm now documenting, but I have no time for this. So let me just say very briefly, of more than 800 volumes that he has on his shelf, you can very easily, with one click, you can see where those books of the most important Polish Maskil come from, where they were published, what does it say about the construction of his understanding of words, right? Where it's rooted in which literary traditions, what is division of topics among those books, and on and on. You can do much more to this. But that was one of two suggestions. Second suggestion is I believe we need to go more egalitarian. As I was already saying, we need to go beyond looking on rabbinical elites. And let me say that looking on elite is traditional failure of many historiographies or much research in humanities, because it is more tempting and it is much easier to look into the famous because they leave more sources and it is related to more to better known historical events, narratives, and on. So this is more tempting, it is easier. But I believe that Jewish historiography is especially tainted by this kind of, I say, yeshivish fascination with important texts, important sources, and certain textual practices that are rooted in fascination for central texts of Jewish intellectual tradition, and ignoring the other sources that I was listing before as secondary, as not so important. With all those limitations, we know very little about egalitarian life. We know very little about rank and file Hasidim. We know very little about Maskilim, who did not write important books, but still they were part of the movement in a sense of interacting and creating social reality, of spreading Hasidic ideas. And actually, how little we know about those relations, you can nicely learn from the book by Moti Zalkin on Jewish education, which is a major project, but also halfway outcomes, because the book does not finally establishes relations between Haskalah and those educational programs. And the third one of the suggestion is more academic freedom. I might be speaking about Poland only, but I'm in a situation when I need to say we are in danger of state intervention, of the increasingly neo-authoritarian involvement of the state into academic freedom in some areas of our research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcin. Bardzo dziękuję. Very fascinating and vivid lecture. And yet we have one question from another participant, Dr. Tzachi Slater, please.
Thank you, Professor Wodziński. That was illuminating in so many ways. I mean, I can have more than one or two questions, but I want to focus about what you said, trying to categorize modernization of Jewish life in Eastern Europe through you mentioned two categories, which is Haskalah and assimilation, and I have few thoughts in that regard. First of all, I think we have to consider what I don't know if assimilation is the right word, but certainly modernized Jewish so-called assimilationists, which are involved in, which get, I don't know, so to speak, academic education or other secular or non-Jewish education, and we have the Maskilim, but we have a lot of Jewish religious society, which is wide and widespread, which also goes into several modernization yeah, and I agree, we need to have a way to categorize it or define it in a way that we can explain it to students, explain it to ourselves, explain it to the wider public, and therefore I think that only Haskalah and assimilations are not enough. There is the problem also of Haskalah is I like to call it as a demon or as a curse that sometimes is very constant in contemporary discourse, that people are called Maskilim or even call themselves Maskilim, but they are not exactly what we would define as part of the Haskalah movement. I can only, at the top of my head, there is the article of Yosef Salmon about the Maskilic rabbi or Rava Maskil or something like that, which I think is illuminating in a way that that by the last third of the 19th century, Maskil is becoming a very wide used word for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes to attack a man or a woman, and sometimes just to define. There is the notion of Hamaskilim Amitim, the true Maskilic, that Orthodox rabbis use people that can write modern literature in order to confront Haskalah or to confront themes that they don't encourage. And those people sometimes called the Maskilim Amitim, like there is this notion. And so there is something to be said about the use of the maskil in that regard, and there is something to be said about general processes that the rabbinical elite go through at the time, and as you said, we need to go beyond the rabbinical elite, but also the rabbinical elite, because it is a lit. We have a lot of sources about the rabbinic elite, so it can give us some sense about the processes that it's going through. And I think we can, from the little that I know, we can see very major developments in that regard. We can see rabbis starting to write modern literature, starting to engage in sciences, starting to engage in philosophy. And this is just I don't know, just a few thoughts at the top of my head, when we should go at some point in history, go beyond the narrative of Haskalah, although it is very, it is constantly appear in contemporary discourse. I don't know if that makes sense.
Thank you all. Vitaly, my question is, should I respond immediately or we collect more comments and questions? It's up to you.
Oh, Marcin, please respond now. Yeah.
Okay, so I respond. First of all, Tsahi, thank you for your comments, for your compliments first, and then for what you said. That important comments and questions in also for me to allow to clarify, which I believe might be not so clear, because there is kind of contradiction in what I was saying. On the one hand, I was saying we miss conceptual clarity about those categories of Haskalah, reform, assimilation, integration, secularization. And on the other hand, I was saying to de-essentialize our discourse. Those are in some way contradictory, because I'm not saying that we need to include what you are advocating. It seems to me what we define as masculine. We don't have the right to define historical reality. We have the right to describe it. And the point is that historical reality, by rule, much more often than not, goes beyond the artificial definitions we might create in order to contain. That's all the problem, I believe, that if we assume that maskil is such and such, it might not describe properly historical figures that were, I don't know, 87% of a maskil and 13% of something else. I'm just pulling your leg now, right? Because that's not the way to approach those realities. And if we look into groups of historical agents, if we don't look in, for example, interactions between those people, issues that we know are today with the tools of digital analysis of social network analysis are so easy to do. Guys, I don't know, I cannot comprehend until now why we don't have the database of all Maskilic letters ever written, person to person, to draw the most precise map of social interactions between Maskilic words, to establish centers, peripheries, dynamics, importance, to establish sociometric stars, to establish clusters of Maskilim. We still follow very traditional narratives about boundaries between Galicia and Volhynia, even though if we go into the ground realities, we know that this boundary was very porous, and actually for the Maskilim it was very easy to move between Volhynia and Galicia, referring to our topic of Ukraine now today, right? Which is today both in Ukraine, but also then in two empires. It was not like the boundary between Poland and Belarus today, right? With hundreds of soldiers standing and protecting European Union from Afghans. It is not so, simply put. More generally, in this problem of Haskalah, other forms of modernity and other forms of modernization, what we lack, when I say about conceptual clarity, is more understanding that we are talking about categories. We're talking about pears and oranges, or apples and oranges. We are talking about modernization as project, and speaking essentially about an idea, right? We have people who develop certain concept of modernity, how it should be, the project of Haskalah, the project of integrationism, and on and on. And we are talking about process of modernization and modernity as an outcome of process. And they are intertwined, obviously, those two, but they're not the same. We have people who are part of the process of modernization, like Hasidim. And here I refer to the opening chapter on the big book on Hasidism history, which is saying Hasidism is the form of Jewish modernity because it's looking for new forms of collective life in a modernized world, responding to the issue of modernization, of industrialization, of urbanization, right? All those changes. And Hasidism, even though we obviously on the level of project, it's anti-modernism. Anti-modernist. On the level of process, it is part of modernity. So this is modernization of East European Jews too, right? So if we don't establish clarity on this most essential level, then it's very difficult for us to understand what we are talking. Are we talking about ideas of those people, or are we talking about the social actions? Or are we talking about the social actions of ideas also? Because those issues are closely interrelated, right? And last but not least, Tsahi, I'm not advocating against studying a rabbinical elite. Of course not. It's still so much to do. I'm just saying that we need to look beyond it too. We need to understand the rabbi without followers is not a rabbi. The tzaddik needs Hasidim, rank and file Hasidim, to become the rebbe, right? And actually, Hasidic literature admits it too. But then we need to understand what it really means in historical realities of Jewish Eastern Europe.
Thank you. Marcin, we have two more questions, or rather comments, and then we need to finish. So the first one comes from Professor Benjamin Brown. Please, Benjamin.
Hi, Marcin.
Hi, Benny.
It was fun listening to you. Really, I enjoyed it. Thank you. Both knowledgeable and intriguing. First of all, just a clarification or question. What's really the relation, the logical relation between the two parts of your lecture? And you started with the different fields of interest in the research of Eastern European Judaism, Jewry, in Israel and other countries, etc. And then you swiftly moved into the question of categorization of different publics within Eastern European Jewry. At least I didn't fully understand what's the logical connection between the two parts. Now, regarding the categorization itself, I definitely, I basically agree with you. But as you noted yourself, and I'd like to stress that point, focusing on clear or well-defined identities is quite natural to every historian, every person who really reads history, and therefore also to people who write history, because I mean, in every society you have a kind of clear, well-defined identities, and on the other hand, some more blurred identities, and sometimes really those who are in the middle and they don't identify with anything. But when you write the history of a certain group or a certain society, you always focus on the ones with clear identity. If someone ever writes the history of Europe of today, I think it'll be quite natural, you expect that he or she will write about that it was divided between right and left. And although we know that in the Europe of today, most of the many, almost, I don't, it differs from country to country, but many people do not vote at all, and or have some, or can define themselves as political left, but economic right, or vice versa. And these blurred identities, first of all, are frankly less interesting in truth, but also many of these people don't write, don't publish, and don't go to demonstrations, and are not active in the public arena. So they're really in some way transparent. So it's quite understandable that they do not have to take the same share in our interest and therefore in our writing as the ones who have clear identities. Also, and I know this this position is not broadly accepted today. Also, we write history and people read history in order to learn something. And frankly speaking, once again, it's not so politically correct, but frankly speaking, there's not much to learn from these people. In that respect, I think the division of interest is natural and understandable. I will also ask you, you write about the plain Jew, the ordinary Jew that is not a Hasid, not a Maskil. He got up in the morning, he don't feel in, he prayed Shachris, he wore his talis, he went to work, he went back home, he ate, he drank, he went to sleep, he went to Mincha. Okay, I mean, what do you expect real people to say about them? So the only thing in which I can really agree with you or identify with you, I agree with you basically that it deserves interest, but I think it mainly deserves interest. I know that today there is an approach of grassroots history and writing about the plain people were not less interesting, and et cetera, et cetera. They're not less interesting when you take them as something exemplary for broader history or to learn from them about broader phenomena. But focusing on them as personae, as individuals, I think they are less interesting. And that's why basically the question arises, in what sense they deserve research. They do deserve research, as I said, when they are part of broader phenomena that can exemplify broader phenomena, or in the more, I would say, quantitative aspect, when you really want to, and that I think is done, when you want to really describe a demography or something of Eastern European Jewry or Polish Jewry or whatever, say this percentage was Maskilim, that percentage was Hasidim, and the other were non-identified. That's interesting, and that should be done. But I'm not sure there's much to do beyond that. Another point that I'd like to make, and this is, it looks like a different comment, but it's a continuation regarding women, for example, but it's also a question of identification with a group. There is a great difference between people who are not identified at all, that if you ask them, they would say, I'm not a Hasid, I'm not a Maskil, and people who are identified but are not defined as Hasidim, for example, in that case. Because the Hasidic woman, even though she's not a Hasid, and I agree with you on that, and I agree with Ada on the fact that she was not full-fledged Hasid, she was still a Hasidic woman in the sense that she will foster a Hasidic atmosphere in her home. She will send her son to a Hasidic cheder or Hasidic yeshiva if there is such in close distance. In many aspects, she's a part of the Hasidic community, even though she's not Hasidic, and this once again is something that does not blur identity as a contrary to what I said before. This is not a blurred identity. This is a very clear identity that doesn't take full part in all the aspects of Hasidic life and mutatis mutandis to other social groups.
Vitaly, again, do I respond immediately or we collect the other question too or comment?
No, please respond now, Marcin.
Okay, because there is a lot to respond, so I'm afraid it might take a bit more time. First of all, Benny, thank you for your comments. Well, we talk about this issue for so long that some of them I could predict. I would say that we agree that we disagree on them, on those, right? Thank you for your question regarding the structure of what I was saying. I was talking about the stereotypes of how we perceive our field, that we might perceive it as too important. So first, I wanted to say as kind of introduction, then in relation to other field of importance outside of Eastern Europe, study on Eastern Europe is not central to Jewish historiography anymore, which is surprising if you look on historical reality of Jewish life throughout modern periods, right? From 1500, the vast majority of Jews globally lived in Eastern Europe. Depending on time, 50%, 70% or up to 80% lived in either Eastern Europe or in the Ottoman Empire. And if so, it means that this should be the focus of the study on modern Jewry, and it is not. The vast majority of publications on early modern Jews goes into what? France, Germany, Atlantic, and other issues. So this is surprising, and we need to understand it. I believe there is also pedagogical aspect in what I'm saying, because we need to talk about this misperspectives in order to reevaluate, to give more weight in historical narratives to those areas which are neglected, not because they are less interesting and not because there are less sources on this. They are totally different ethnocentric and neo-colonial forces, because it's much nicer to spend summer vacation in Trieste than in, than in Kharkiv, and to go into archive in Trieste or Paris than to go into the archive in Krakow or Kharkiv, right? Or Chernobyl. And simply so, what is the relation of this simple fact to the historical importance and value of the sources we can find there? None, but it informs the way how historians, scholars in general behave. And with those, we need to, so that was my first introduction. And second, notional stereotypes about importance of Hasidism and Haskalah in the field of East European Jewish studies. And here again, I say they are notional stereotypes that overemphasize this in relation to what was historical reality. And that's the only introduction to what I was discussing about the notional stereotypes in this, describing mostly Hasidism, which I spend most of my historical research on, but also the Haskalah. So that's
that explains. Thank you.
And now, as for focusing on those well-defined identities, you are certainly right if you look on historiography as a compelling narrative. If you look, and also if you know that what we like listening to are songs that we know, right? So if we look for stories that look similar to stories we know and accept as important, we look into lives of other important people, right? Because we recognize patterns. But this is against vocation of us scholars, historians, that we need to put into questions those stereotypes that put us onto the trodden path. We need to ask why, and we need to ask what if not, if we do it the other way. And then I believe we can learn much more from individuals who are not boring and, according to one pattern, if they are not famous and didn't leave much source. And here, obviously, the same issues that you were raising against researching those people are those you could hear 100 years ago against researching women. No, they were not so important. We don't have sources for them. But then gender and feminist studies and women's studies show us we do have sources. if we read them against what they say, if we read them in order to find those patterns, and then how revealing information comes out of this. And I'm not talking about this kind of compensational history, saying Moshe Lossman was calling it Me Too. It was still before Me Too wave. He was saying that men were important rulers. We too, we women too were important rulers, right? Men were warriors. We too were warriors, right? And on. This is one way of doing this in early feminist historiography. But what we have now is much more fascinating, much more interesting, because it says, well, there were some gender roles. They were mostly for men, and there were other mostly for women. And what they did is not less interesting. It's simply different. The same with people who don't distinguish for intellectual achievements or political achievements, and who did not lead so much source. You say they are not interested in the individuality. I firmly believe that, starting from Carlo Ghim's book and his describing of a simple miller in his Menocchio, right, in his Cheese and the Worms, you can learn amazingly issues about the worldviews of simple people. Amazing issues which allow us to understand that simple people are not simpler than intellectuals. They have also 100% of the world beliefs and their categories. And the fact is that we don't approach it. It doesn't mean that this is less interesting. The fact that we never studied it doesn't mean that it does not deserve to be studied. So here, I totally disagree with your point that this is interesting only if we look on in a quantitative category, right?
My argument was less focused on plain people against important people, more about the people of better defined identity in contrast to people with undefined or blurred identity. That was
okay, but
the gist of my argument.
Many actually example that you gave in support of your argument here was, I believe, extremely good argument against it, because what you are saying, it was comparing to contemporary realities. Yes, we know that there are some people who are well-defined Trumpists and some people who are well-defined anti-Trumpists, but majority are not, even though we are living in increasingly polarizing world, right? And now we fully understand it. But if we look back on historical reality, we tend to oversee, actually to ignore existence of this big part of society, which is neither Hasidic nor anti-Hasidic, who are indifferent, ambivalent, changing their attitudes. And this is reality. You might say they are less interesting, but they are majority of the society. If we want to understand how society functions, and I believe this is one of the major missions of historiography as social science, and not so much about narrative only, is to understand how society functioned. Those people allows us to understand how it was so. And you are also thinking about Hasidic women having, some of them having not Hasidic identity, some of them having blurred identity. That's the point exactly. We go beyond the definition of what is Hasidic, and then finally we realize there were women, they were obviously not Hasidic, but they were still strongly influenced by Hasidic values and Hasidic culture. And what do we do with them, right? And we go into other categories of people. What do we do about Christians who were Hasidic culturally? And who were? We know about, well, it's not a big group of people, but also we cannot say they were honorary Hasid. In Hamishpaha, they wrote an article about me. You might remember the review of my atlas, and they put the title Goy Hasid, right? We are not the category yet, but well, obviously there were such people in Eastern Europe, and we don't know what to do about them. If we stick to this well-defined essentialist categories, if we leave them behind, if we understand they were working, but they were not true, and those categories were not identical for all of people of historical reality, we have much bigger field of tool at our disposal to understand it, to understand those people who, like us today, were so different from each other, as we are different from each other today.
Bardzo dziękuję. Thank you so much, Marcin, for your lecture. For colleagues, thank you for your questions and for your answers, Marcin. So, yeah, our applause goes to you.
Thanks a lot.